Venezuela's deposed president, Nicolás Maduro, has made his first U.S. court appearance in a New York federal court yesterday, pleading not guilty to federal charges while insisting that he is still Venezuela's president. Now, he's facing charges of drug trafficking and narco-terrorism, among others. Maduro was captured in a U.S. military operation in the early hours of January the 3rd, and this follows months of steadily mounting pressure on the Venezuelan government. But whether the capture and removal of Maduro will lead to regime change in Venezuela is still unclear at present. Well, to discuss this matter further, we are now joined by Associate Professor of Law at the Wits School of Law and Director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies, Professor Prof Gevers. Professor, thanks so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you for having me.
So what a way to start the year off with something that could potentially lead to, among other things, the trial of the century with Nicolás Maduro being indicted there in a New York federal court. What did you make of these developments, especially given the build-up to the ultimate capture of Nicolás Maduro?
I think, it was staggering, even for an empire that routinely violates international law. The US was really exceeded itself. There really there's no justification, there's no serious justification under international law for this action. It violates, I was counting this morning, at least 6 different principles of international law. And it's not so much its breadth, but its severity. It's a serious violation of perhaps the founding principle of international law post-1945, which is that you can't use force on another state's territory without its consent.
Now, Prof, and I'm glad that, you are just very clear on that particular matter, because it did seem that some countries, were struggling to come out and clearly articulate that for whatever reason, because the question is a simple one. Did Washington breach international law by capturing Nicolás Maduro, a sitting president, in the way that they did?
Absolutely. As I said, there's at least 6 reasons why, but I'll go through a couple. So the first one is that as I said, you can't use force on the territory of another state without their consent. The only exceptions to that are Security Council authorization, which clearly doesn't exist in this instance, or if you are attacked by that state in what's called an armed attack, you have a right of self-defense. Now, there's no justification to say that what the conduct of the drug cartels in the US amounts to an armed attack. It doesn't meet the severity for an armed attack. It's not a use of force. And in any event, that armed attack would have to be attributable back to Venezuela for them to be attacked in response. It's important to point out, though, that one might want to exceptionalize this to Donald Trump, but this is really part of a pattern of the US extending the bounds of self-defense for a number of years. Hence the recitation of the word terrorism to try and invoke that jurisprudence, which in itself is unlawful. The US has been using force unlawfully across the world for a long time, but this is a particularly extreme example. That's the first one. Another one is you can't send your police to arrest someone in the territory of another state, whoever they are, let alone a president. Exercising the kind of enforcement action on the territory of another state that the US did, so leaving aside the military action, just sending the police, is a violation of the sovereignty of that state. You can't arrest the sitting head of state. They have immunity from prosecution. That's absolute. You can't tell another state how to run its affairs. That's a violation of the principle of intervention. And you can't tell a state we're going to run you and use your resources. That's a violation of the permanent sovereignty of national resources. So that's 5. I could go on, but at the very least, these are all very clear violations. I haven't seen any serious legal argument from the US in this regard, and I haven't seen anyone really willing to defend it. The question really is what to do about it.
Well, Marco Rubio did attempt to kind of walk back President Donald Trump's assertion that they are now running Venezuela. And that in itself is quite interesting, given how things have actually panned out there, because it seems as though Venezuela has now been plunged into confusion around what is going on. People are talking about regime change. Well, strictly, the Maduro regime is still in charge. So what is actually going on there?
That was a good, interesting example of how the kind of difficult corner the US has painted itself into, because by trying to avoid one violation, they just committed another, which is they said, okay, fine, we're not going to colonize and run you, but if you don't do what we want you to do, you might lose your life, essentially. Now, that's a violation of the principle of non-intervention. You can't threaten the state and say, well, we're not going to colonize you, but if you don't do what we want to do, we're going to assassinate your president or use force against you. That's also the threat of the use of force is in itself a violation of international law, and that clearly was a threat of the use of force.
Prof, you touch on the word colonization there, which is also interesting because it's quite instructive listening to the language being used by Donald Trump and his administration at this time. Donald Trump saying that they are in charge of the Western Hemisphere. And you know, that raised quite a few eyebrows in terms of what does he actually mean by that? And when it comes to Venezuela and the charges against Nicolás Maduro, again, what is this actually about? Is it about narco-terrorism? Is it about politics? Or is it about oil, strictly speaking?
So Donald Trump has a tendency to say the quiet part out loud, and it makes our job a little bit easier, right? So that we, as internationalists, might have said between the lines, we think it's about oil. This has been very plainly stated by the US. This is about oil, and that in itself is a violation of international law, as I say. Again, I think it's important to focus on what's unique about this moment, but also recognize that the US has been acting like a colonial power in South America for decades. It's been intervening. The capacity to run this operation is in part because of the bases the US operates all over the world and the buildup of troops and ships on the territories, on the territorial sea around Venezuela.
And of course, the implications of this action is also what has other world leaders worried about what could possibly happen to them. Again, countries being mentioned, speaking of what's happening in Iraq, for example, where Donald Trump said if they kill people, if people ask for help, that the US will come to their aid. Then you've got the other threats against countries like Mexico, Colombia, and of course the Greenland issue, which seems to set NATO on a very interesting collision course should he persist, or maybe even worse, as in the case of Venezuela, go over to action.
Absolutely. I think this was a very bad start to the year for the Europeans in particular, not just because of the question of NATO and Greenland, but because of this action is such a brazen violation. It's very difficult for the Europeans to credibly call out, for example, China if they took action against Taiwan, and Russia in its action against Ukraine. It's become difficult to, with a straight face, call those violations of international law if one doesn't call this what it is. But again, I think it's important to locate this in the context of a broader, expansive military strategy. It's one that the US has set out very clearly in its national defense strategy, which doesn't just talk about controlling the Western Hemisphere, it talks about civilizational decline. I mean, this is language that is reminiscent of the 19th century, both in terms of the imperial ambitions, but also in terms of the heavily loaded racialized language about there being certain countries that are civilized and that we have a right to control and civilize those that misbehave. And so it's very concerning, but there is a strong multilateral system that needs to respond. And unfortunately, there's aspects of that system that the US controls. And once again, we have to ask ourselves, what is the Security Council's use if one of the most flagrant violators of international has a veto power? And so I think the time is now ready for both immediate conversations, but longer conversations about structural reform that are long overdue to make sure that the conditions of possibility that enable this kind of flagrant behavior are not limited to Trump. This is an empire acting the way that empires do.
And speaking of that Emergency Security Council meeting yesterday, let's just take a listen to what the US ambassador to the UN had to say.
You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela. But it doesn't stop there. Numerous UN and international human rights organizations have issued reports documenting serious human rights abuses by the Maduro regime, including reports of extrajudicial killings, political prisoners, torture, and arbitrary and unlawful detentions.
So there you have it. Again, a very interesting, and saying this in the UN Security Council. And to your point, it's a clear demonstration of the limitations of, the international law as far as its application is concerned. And I was listening to the debate in the UK House of Commons yesterday, where again people were at pains to try and distance themselves from what the Trump administration is doing right now, but not being able to call this thing for what it is, a flagrant transgression of international law.
Absolutely. I mean, if you take those two in turn, so the language about there being resources that aren't being used properly. I mean, this is colonial discourse, right? The arguments for colonization was, well, these resources don't belong to the people, or they don't know how to use them, or they're using them badly. There are many examples of history invented by the Europeans, by the way, about how to use this kind of discourse to colonize and to use violence. So it's clearly invoking a particular history. The invocation of, and it's true, yes, the Maduro regime committed a number of human rights violations, did an international criminal court investigation, but again, that type of language lies ill in the mouth of the US, given the way they protected Israel, not just for decades, but particularly in the last few years, when there's been numerous international organizations that have said that there's a genocide in Gaza. The ICJ has issued binding provisional orders with respect to that conflict. And there's been an action from the US and an action at the Security Council. So you can't invoke the law in one instance and clearly flagrantly violate in another. Or you can, but there must be consequences. And those consequences need to start with reforming the mechanisms that are designed to ensure international peace and security, which begins with the Security Council but doesn't end at it means.
That, of course, is also a conversation that has been coming for quite some time. Is there any real appetite to actually deal with that particular matter, to make sure that there is reform of these institutions, Professor?
Absolutely right. It's been a conversation that's been happening certainly at the instance of African states since independence. I mean, people like to cite Nelson Mandela's inaugural foreign relations speech. One of the things he said is you need to reform the Security Council. And for the longest time, African states were on the lead and more or less alone on this. This changed for a brief moment. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was talk from the Europeans about, well, maybe we need to reform the Security Council. And that talk has quieted down. But I do think if there is a moment to do this, the moment is now. That it's very clear across a number of different conflicts that the Security Council is no longer fit for purpose. I like to tell my students that the Security Council is something that if it wasn't around 50 years ago, there wouldn't have been a UN. And if it's still around in 50 years, there won't be a UN. That there's just no credible way the UN can continue with the current imbalance of power, particularly given the actions of the permanent 5 members.
And then, of course, back to Venezuela and what is happening there now. As we touched on earlier in the conversation, it seems that confusion has taken over here because the opposition would have imagined perhaps that the Trump administration would side with them, but this hasn't quite turned out that way. And we saw one of the opposition leaders declaring that he is now the president. Nobody seems to know what's going on.
Absolutely. And there wasn't even a sort of a pattern of well, this is about democracy. It was very clear that at least the candidate that from the outside, at least in the Western world, would be the most obvious candidate to take over, was immediately disqualified by Trump as not having the support of the people. So it's not really clear what is the strategy. The concern is that some of the language used was that they're going to fix the oil infrastructure or send in the big oil companies. And one worry is that what you're going to have is an army of mercenaries going into the country, secure certain installations, and then let the rest of the country fall or leave it to its own devices. It's very dangerous. We know this. It's not a lesson we need to learn again, but we keep learning it. That when you take out a very powerful, strong dictator, it creates a vacuum. We've seen this in Iraq and Libya, various places all over the world, and it's almost inevitable. So there might well be stability in the immediate sense, but in the long-term sense, it's very clear that the US has an ambition for Venezuela that involves natural resources, and it's not possible to do that without using significant force.
And we have a minute left, but I have to ask you about the indictments on Maduro and his wife. And just looking at those 4 indictments, what do you make of those? Because no doubt we'll talk more about those as the trial commences. But your initial thoughts on this?
I think it must be said that there is a right under international law to try individuals who commit crimes outside your territory that has impacts inside your territory. South Africa does this routinely, for example, in respect of war crimes and genocide. And there is a need, obviously, for the US to take action in respect of drugs, whether or not, A, they can do that in violation of international law, which we can't, whether or not this is the correct case. So we've seen other examples of the US pardoning people that were convicted of the very same crimes. So unfortunately, the language of narco-terrorism, the excuse of drug cartels, has been used for so long in South America by the US that it's difficult to take it seriously. Although it's been said the charges are very serious and they should be investigated, but they can't be investigated under conditions in flagrant violation of international law.
Professor Gevers, thanks so much for your time this morning. Appreciate it. Associate Professor at Wits Law School and Director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies, Professor Christopher Gevers, speaking to us there about some of the legalities of that operation that the United States carried out in capturing the now deposed Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro.